right, guys. So now that we're back doing lectures, the next module that we're going to talk about is the Victorian era, and really looking at Victorian agriculture and science and even pseudoscience. So we're kind of staying in the same time period as the last series of lectures, but instead of looking at politics, we're going to look more at culture. And I think that a lot of people, frankly, find this aspect of the liberalism, socialism, nationalism, conservatism conversation a little bit more interesting. I know how much everybody just loves talking politics more than culture, So, of course, this era, there's going to be a lot of economic and political changes that are going to occur in Europe during the 19th century. And the things that occurred that we talked about in the last module became to kind of equally showcase these momentous shifts in culture and learning as well. And it's very important, to learn about the culture and the culture of this era, which again we called Victorianism, or the Victorian era. And it's named after Queen Victoria, who is right here on the left. It's a culture in which the bourgeoisie dominate, and it's, that's the wealthy middle class group, right? And the middle class at least sort of looks at themselves as elite and wealthy now, and they start to act more like the nobles than they do the lower middle class or the poor people, right? It wasn't that long ago, there was no middle class. It was poor people and elite. And then they kind of created this middle class, and now they're at the point where they're going, well, we're more like the elite than the poor people. We're going to act like that. And so they're going to put up some major hurdles in the form of culture to kind of separate themselves out. And again, Queen Victoria is going to preside over kind of the height of the British Empire and British imperialism. And the Victorian culture is that of like top hats and dresses that are going to cover every inch of the female body, and you're going to have rigid gender norms and almost a pathological fear of sexuality in a lot of ways. I know it's kind of interesting. There's the defining characteristic, though, and this is probably something right here on the first slide of the whole module that is a key thing you need to remember. The main motivation for a lot of these rigid structures that are put in place is for security of power, okay? These people that have moved themselves out of the poor people into the middle class don't ever want to end up back with the poor people again. So they're going to say, well, we have to find a way to distinguish ourselves, the bourgeoisie, from just the poor people, right? And so how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to say that if you're a part of us, women act this way. And if you're a part of us, men act this way. And if you're a part of us, you don't do this in public. And if you're a part of this, you do this in public, right? And so that's going to be really the defining characteristic. And so class divisions are very much made visible in a lot of different ways. Clothing is one of them in a big way. Depending on what class you were in, depended on what kind of clothing you were allowed to wear. You literally kind of had class uniforms almost, which is kind of a weird thing. And so the bourgeoisie, they are not noble, but they kind of start acting like them, and they start mixing in with them. And basically, they want to have superiority. Men want to have superiority over women. Whites want to have superiority over blacks. The academics want to have superiority over the uneducated. The wealthy want to have security over the poor, all of these things. So they're going to set up these power structures. Now, as we mentioned, there's some very strong, rigid gender norms. The two images that you can see here is kind of the stereotypical dress, right? You have top hats and, basically walking around in tuxedos everywhere you go. And then you have these many, many layered dresses that are, you've got the whole corsets and all that stuff, and extremely, the wealthier you were, the more uncomfortable you had to dress, essentially, right? I can't imagine walking around in a corset. I can't imagine asking anyone to walk around in a corset. That's crazy. And so, but that was just how it was. And it really kind of came with this idea of European confidence and the idea that Europe should kind of dominate the rest of the globe. The British are going to dominate, and they are going to, take this idea and spread it around the globe. So you're going to start to see this European culture of gender norms and being implemented all over the globe. In order to enforce these strict roles and these strict guidelines, they're going to use the threat of financial ruin. So, like, the threat of being called, improprietous sexually, or basically, someone, running your name down in the mud for, being messy or whatever. And, they would threaten to ruin your business if you get caught doing something you're not supposed to be doing or that's not acceptable. If immoral behavior is discovered in public, you would really be put into a really bad spot socially and in the rest of the culture. So there's this overwhelming desire to separate themselves and say, we should be better than everyone else. It's kind of crazy. Again, it's all based on security. You have Sigmund Freud, who comes in and says that the Victorian era is kind of a time where you see the suppression of natural instincts. Everything that feels natural, they were like, natural, that's how poor people live. Naturally, that's bad. So we should do everything unnatural, which is kind of weird. I know. Of course, human nature being what it is, people are going to seek to justify these kinds of views and all sorts of things, and there's going to be this internal mechanism that they're going to have to use to explain their, superiority over other people. Of course, they're going to be faulty beliefs, of course, because nobody is better than anyone else. But wealthy people come to believe that their wealth is actually a marker of their virtue and piety, right? They actually truly got to the point where the wealthy people think, I'm wealthy because I'm a good person. Just let that sink in. I'm wealthy. God has blessed me with wealth because God thinks I'm a good person. And if you think, okay, well, I can kind of see like, okay, God is blessing me and God loves me, so he's giving us, giving me what I need, and he's giving me maybe that. But then the other side of that coin is you're poor because you're a bad person. You must be poor because God doesn't love you as much as me. That's not good. That's a bad way of looking at that. That's an absolutely terrible thing. There is no moral connection between virtue and economic success, right? Lots of crooks have a lot of money. Lots of the best people on planet Earth are poor, right? Money does not make you a better person. But there's a lot of people out there that even still believe that I have more money, that means I'm a better person. Look at all the money I give away. Great, okay, but you're giving it away and then you're like, hey, everybody, look at this check I gave. That's not morality, right? And so, they also believe that there is no such thing as luck, right? That you were lucky to be born with money. No. God formed me. Okay, I'll give you that. And then, because he knew how wonderful of a person I was going to be, gave me to my parents because they had money and he wanted me to have money. Hold on. I don't think that's how that's working. Oh, yes, that's how it works. They don't really believe that hard work does anything. You shouldn't be able to work your way out of God's wrath on you, right? They just kind of think, I'm good, you're evil, that's why I'm happy and you're not. And so, again, they believe that, that you could identify moral traits with science as well. That science is making, major steps forward during this time period, and they go, hey, they begin to be very naive and overly optimistic about what that science could actually do. So they become champions of the notion that, everyone gets what they deserve and that science would eventually kind of ratify and clarify and defend that natural social order. What they fear more than anything is that the working class will somehow overwhelm them through a revolution like communism, that the workers will rise up and throw them out. And so they tend to fear that there's going to be a decline or a breakdown in society. So you have this arrogance of superiority, and that is inherent in these views. And it's going to create this idea that lower class is bad. They're genetically worse than us in a sense. They're inferior. They're made of inferior materials. They're inferior in character. They're inferior in ethics. They're inferior in morality. In order to protect all of society, we have to make sure they don't get any power, because if they get into power, the whole thing will fall apart. And so, obviously, it's kind of crazy. Now, when you return to the idea of the upper or middle and upper classes fearing the lower class, there's this kind of remarkable contrast between the ideology of Victorian life and the reality. And so what's actually happening in the real world. And so even though the fear of this social degradation is really exaggerated, we're going to have a situation where you're going to see a lot of the culture start to shift. Alcoholism and drug use are going to become far more common during the Victorian era, and not with poor people. The people who are going, we're better than you, we're in all these ways better than you, they're the ones that are going to be alcoholics and drug users. Drugs become cheaper and easier to come by because of urbanization. Jobs in cities kind of lend itself to casual drinking in bars. Stuff like cocaine is openly regarded as more of a medicinal pick-me-up, than anything else. I don't have that slide, but basically, you'd have advertisements for cocaine from the time period, and they'd be like, hey, it's a cure-all. Like, hey, ladies, are you tired from a hard day's work? Do a little cocaine. Then you'll have dinner ready in no time. For real. They're like, that baby won't stop crying? Give him some ether, which is like morphine. It'll shut that baby up in a heartbeat. Then you do a little cocaine and you'll get the house clean in no time. Right? Like in the same way that you might be like, oh, I need some energy. I'll go get a Red Bull. They're like, I need some energy. Let me do some Coke. And they would put it in the newspapers. Yeah. You didn't even have to just go buy some cocaine. Right? And it was rampant. And again, the upper class, they'd go to dinner and dip their strawberries in ether. And then eat them. So they're like, and then they're like, oh gosh, I'm so glad that we're so much better than those poor people. They're just terrible people. It's just, out, doing drugs, drinking all they can, wasting money. God just really loves us so much more than them. Yeah, that's what they're dealing with. So you have a lot of novels that start to expose this. And I know that we think of these two, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Did y'all read that this year? Yeah? Okay, as juniors, you'll read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Did y'all go over the idea that it's an allegory to what's happening at this point in time? Did y'all talk about that? Who am I asking? Stupid. I'm so dumb. So, no, so basically, Dr. Jekyll, that's the idea that you have this well-respected doctor, right? But he has a bad side, a monster side, right? That's kind of, this guy is writing this about the entirety of the upper class, the bourgeoisie. Basically saying, hey, they're all doctors and lawyers and they're respectable people in public, but there's a monster inside them, right? It's really a commentary on society. Same thing with Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? Dracula, he's a terrible beast, but he's this rich guy with a big castle, and people want to come to his parties because they think that, if you get invited to his party, they're like, man, Kathy went there 2 months ago, and they've been partying it up ever since. Nobody's seen her since. She must be having a great time. No, bro, she got 8. You know what I'm saying? And so this idea of like, that you have rich people that are projecting one thing, but really behind the scenes, they are the bad guys. They're the monsters that they say everybody else is. And it's really interesting to see that commentary on that. The biggest Victorian obsession, though, is with categorizing people in these, in like gender. Male writers and theorists and even scientists claim that men and women were opposites, that men are rational and forceful and naturally more courageous, contrasted to, the irrational but very gentle woman. And obviously, that was played out with like how they should dress and what jobs they should have and what spheres they should live in, the domestic sphere or the public sphere, right? It's a very male-dominated view, which is really, convenient when you say women aren't allowed to get educated and write stuff. And then you go, see, women can't write stuff. Men are clearly better. I mean, that's one way to prove your point, right? Men are smarter. Well, how do we know? We should let women get educated. No, they can't handle that. They're not smart enough. But you won't let them get educated. Yeah, because they're not smart enough. But what? I'm glad you get it. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of how the attitude was. The rest of the world is really going to start to kind of follow along with this in a lot of ways. And so, it lasts for quite some time. It's very rigid. Restrictions on women are a major factor in the rise of the feminist movement in the second half of this century. And it really goes back to the Victorian era on how men treated women, essentially. We're going to shift gears, talk about some science and pseudoscience. The idea is that this is the science on the left. These are the advancements: medicine, biology, bacteriology, microscopes, germs, hygiene, sociology. All of these things are coming around. And it's great, but they're going to have major ramifications also. And once we get into like the next couple slides, we'll talk about the science of how those things happen and evolution. And then you get to pseudoscience, where it's like, hey, we have evolution, and we're going to use that to justify racism and class distinction and gender divisions, right? And we're going to have science teach us about some people that are just unfit, right? Which is crazy. By far, one of the most significant things to happen during this time period is in the advancements of medicine. Obviously, the slide's a little messed up, but you have Louis Pasteur, who is going to discover bacteria, and he figures out that you can kill it with heat. Yeah. The major development here is, again, staggering. The idea that they finally discover germs, and that's what's making people sick, and that there's these microorganisms that are creating fermentation, disease, and that you can actually treat this. And this is going to lead to like the first vaccines and stuff, right? Because once you figure out what's making you sick, you can now try and treat it. That's why so many people died, like in medicine. They had no idea that like you're supposed to wash your hands before you cut somebody open, or saw their leg off. Oh, you're supposed to wash your hands? Wow. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. They first started vaccines. They were trying to, kill cholera in birds and then like anthrax in livestock. But, then they finally find a vaccine for the dreaded rabies, that if you've ever known anybody that had rabies or an animal that had rabies, like that's a bad thing. Like people used to die of rabies, like that was not uncommon. And it was a terrible way to die, apparently. Very drawn out and makes you very, very, very sick, and you just go crazy and die. And that sucks. And so once you figure out germs, you can treat them. And so obviously that's the biggest thing here. This is going to lead to hospitals becoming more clean, and you're going to lead to sanitation. You're going to learn how to, have bacteria and treat that with like food. You come up with like the pasteurization process, where basically you can take a liquid and make it super hot and then put it into a jar and seal it up, and it will stay good for basically ever. Because if you bring it to a boil, like has anybody ever made jelly before? You've ever made jelly? Like grape jelly, no? Your grandma or your mom or anybody? You've ever watched it made? Basically, you make it and you put the gelatin and then you when you put it in the jar, it's still liquid. And then as it cools, it becomes jelly, right? But you boil it, you get it super hot, and then you pour it in there, and basically all the bacteria is dead in it. And if you seal it up, it'll basically be good forever until you open it back up again. And that's the idea of pasteurization, that now I can preserve food for a long time. We're talking about major, major pushes forward. It's also going to help with cities, with sanitation, understanding, poop is full of germs. If you have poop laying around and then you eat food that has poop on it, you're going to get really sick. And they were like, oh, well, we knew poop was yucky, but remember when we talked about they used to put poop in open wounds? Remember that? They had no clue. They didn't know anything. So it's oh my gosh, this is this is by far one of the biggest impacts for sure. You also have Charles Darwin, who kind of begins to work on the theory of evolution and the origin of species by means of natural selection. He doesn't actually come up with evolution. That's actually a guy named Alfred Wallace in 1858 who first theorizes evolution. But Darwin kind of theorizes how species actually evolve. And so Darwin I'm not a macroevolutionist. I think that that's kind of stupid. There's no evidence whatsoever that humans developed from monkeys. None. If you follow, they go, well, humans and apes, chimpanzees, had 99% the same DNA. And we have similar chromosomal groups. It's wait, hold on. Human beings and bananas share 95% of our DNA. That's a fact, by the way. 95% of our DNA and the DNA of bananas is the same. So did we come out of bananas? That'd be crazy if we did. It'd be like the Trolls movie where they you just peel yourself out of your banana. You just hey, everybody. Don't drop me, I bruise easy. Right? Because bananas. Yeah. Anyways, the evolution is kind of stupid on that scale, but microevolution certainly does happen. Within your own species, you evolve. We are not the same physical humans that we were 1,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. We're not the same. We have certainly evolved. Our brains are basically the same. We basically were the peak of evolution intellectually by then. But Darwin, this idea that he comes up with that, but which is crazy because Charles Darwin was a geologist. So the fact that we give him credit for creating evolution and he was trained as a geologist is kind of dumb. There's a whole lot that you can get into. Gregor Mendel, you probably have heard of that guy. Gregor Mendel, yes. And understanding genetics, right? You also have during this time the birth of the atom, and the development of the periodic table and the ability to classify elements by their atomic number and stuff like that. All of these things are happening during this time. Psychology and sociology, you have people like Sigmund Freud and Ivan Pavlov. Freud is going to be, kind of give birth to the discipline of psychology as a discipline in the early 1900s in a lot of ways. He's going to he believes that the unconscious mind drives people and that people act on that. But psychology is kind of a weird study. Sociology is really psychology and sociology kind of work together. Psychology is the study of how the brain works and how we justify our decisions. Sociology is how we actually kind of put that into practice and how people actually react in the real world based on those psychological ideas. Very valid in a lot of ways. I think it's very easy to manipulate that, though, for your own gain. Psychology and sociology studies. You can kind of, it's not junk science. I'm just saying that it's people have taken advantage of those fields quite a bit. But you have this idea of like Pavlov's dogs, which you may have heard of, which basically he begins to understand something called conditioned responses and stuff like that. Basically, you can be trained to have a certain response. He does that with his dogs when he feeds them and rings a bell, and they salivate because they ring the bell, and then he stops feeding them and just rings the bell, and they still salivate, and he realizes they didn't do that before, so now it must be because he's trained them that the bell means food. And so basically, you can condition people to do what you want, which is really interesting. But then you have the dangers of this, which is pseudoscience, which is what happens when you leave science unchecked by morality or ethics or philosophy or even religion. Evolution is being used to justify white superiority, and people believe that charity towards the unfit will simply make them more unfit. So you have people that are like, we should not help out people that aren't able to survive on their own. Survival of the fittest. We should apply that to humans too, right? And that charity is bad because it just allows people that shouldn't make it to live, right? Or, like taking care of special needs people. That's useless. Like, y'all, it wasn't that long ago. Really? 60, 70 years ago or less? If you had a special needs child, a lot of people just sent them to live in homes. Like their whole lives. They go visit them a couple times a year. Because the idea was nobody is capable of helping these people. And you're really just making them miserable by letting them live in your house because they see you and your family, and then they feel left out, and it's really bad for them. So you know what's better for them? To send them away to live with strangers for their whole lives. That wasn't that long ago. It's kind of crazy. There's been lots of people throughout history who said, people with special needs, they're not even worth living. They're just a burden to society. Kill them. Lots of people. Okay, it's insane. You look here, these are things that were in textbooks. These are made up. These are absolutely false. They just lied. And then since they wrote the textbook, they were like, no, that's true. And people were like, oh, it must be true. Right? Oh, this is what white people's heads look like. And this is what black people's heads look like. And then look at this monkey's head. Which one looks closer? See? Black people are closer to monkeys. That's literally what they said. And then they're like, see? Black people just can't do what white people could do. White people should be in charge. And then that's how they justified it, because they were horrible people that deserve to get kicked in the face. I'm glad they're all dead. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm glad they're all dead. Bunch of jerks. If they weren't dead and somebody that walked through here was like, I lived back then, I think that's real, I'm punch them in the face. No? Well, y'all all seem completely okay that they believe that. Jeez. Anyway, pseudoscience was really messed up. And they used it to show that women are weaker and justified keeping women out of things. They justified keeping white people at the top of the order on things. They justify all these things through basically a made-up science. And that's very dangerous. And that happens quite often if you don't actually, allow people to say and criticize and speak out and prove and get evidence against what you're trying to say. So there you go.